what we're going to start with really is just a brief introduction to ICON, and some of you might have seen some of my colleagues around the various seminars and rooms over the course of the day, or will see them, so I won't spend too much time on that. And then, in order to look at adaptive licensing, we need to know what licensing of a normal or traditional licensing of a clinical trial looks like. So I'll just briefly introduce that and then talk about adaptive clinical trials, and then how to use the adaptive pathways for licensing of medicines, of which one element is the adaptive clinical trial. So who are ICON? Well, we're a clinical research services organization, and we service the pharmaceutical and biotechnological and medical device industries across all phases of clinical trials, as well as in some post-marketing activities, in innovation and IT. So we cover a broad range of services across the pharma sector, whether that's devices, drugs, or biologics. And our aim is to help our customers, who are the industry, to accelerate the development of drugs and devices that save lives and improve the quality of life. And obviously, adaptive licensing is one of the mechanisms that we can use to try and accelerate drug development from what it is now to making sure that drugs are getting on the market faster. And obviously, we would like to be the partner of choice for that journey for all of our customers. And our journey so far has been an interesting one. We're just over 20 years old. We started with 5 employees. We now have 12,500, a little over 12,500 in 38 countries. So ICON is very truly a global organization, and it's one of the strengths in terms of the services we offer around clinical trial support. But today, I suppose the focus of the talk today is to introduce you to adaptive licensing and some of the drivers for why trials are changing and why healthcare is changing are these. It has a growing share of GDP, especially in emerging markets. We have a much different patient population than we traditionally had. We have an aging population with chronic, non-communicable diseases. Technology and innovation, and this whole conference is proof of it, is really enabling healthcare in a way it never did before. We have greater consumer empowerment, patient empowerment. The role of the patient is significantly greater and more important than it ever was before. And payers, so at the end of the journey of drug development, the drugs have to be paid for, and I'm sure all of you have seen in the newspaper over the last while the story of Orkambi for cystic fibrosis here in Ireland, which was licensed, is approved as an approved treatment for cystic fibrosis, but will not be funded at this point in time because it's not considered a value proposition. So the value proposition is the additional piece that payers want to see. So it's not just about whether it will treat the disease, but whether in treating the disease you reduce the healthcare burden for that disease. So in terms of clinical trials and traditional clinical trial regulation, there are 2 key cornerstones. The first is that trial subjects are protected, and the second is that the trial data are credible and accurate. And those 2 principles apply regardless of what type of clinical trial you run, what phase you run it in, and whether or not you use an adaptive design or not. And obviously, approval of a clinical trial involves the submission of a package of data, including a protocol, which is like a roadmap for the trial, the informed consent process, so every patient must sign an informed consent form to say that they are willing to participate in the trial, knowing about all of the risks and some of the potential benefits of that trial. And 2 separate groups assess the application for a clinical trial. The regulatory authorities, so for Ireland, that's the HPRA, or Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency. We have the European Medicines Agency in Europe as well that does some work on clinical trials. And the regulation of clinical trials in Europe is changing in the coming years to be a more centralised process based out of the European Medicines Agency. At the moment, it's pretty national based. So each member state has their own set of legislation upon which the trial process is based. In addition to the regulatory agency, ethics committees also look at the trial application, and that's to make sure that that first cornerstone is met, that trial subjects are appropriately protected, informed, and so on. So the technical data is reviewed by the equivalent of the HPRA, and the ethical data are reviewed by ethics committees. And that traditional process applies no matter what phase of development you're in. So phase 1, initial trials often in healthy volunteers. Phase 2, slightly larger, used to evaluate safety and efficacy in a little bit more detail. Phase 3, several hundred to 1,000 patients, and they evaluate efficacy versus standard of care. So that's the one where you see the gold standard being the randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial. And very often, as you can imagine, with certain diseases, a placebo-controlled trial is completely unethical. You can't give very ill patients nothing. So they are against standard of care in those situations. So you've got existing new drug against standard of care. And then phase 4 is post-approval studies, generally speaking, and the use of real-world data. And we're going to hear an awful lot about that throughout the conference in terms of the mining of data and some of the sources of big data that are available to support the clinical use of individual products. And that's a key part of what adaptive licensing looks like. So some of the main elements of a traditional drug development program, you must design your study, obviously, to make sure that the scientific integrity and credibility of the data will be maintained. There's significant uncertainty in the drug development process always, and limited information in the beginning, so optimal trial design is often difficult. But the key parameters for a trial are defined at the very beginning, and they are held throughout the trial. And that's what makes traditional design very different to adaptive design. There is limited flexibility whether changes could or should be made. So it's not unheard of in traditional development that changes would be made, but the process is not designed to facilitate those changes in an active, proactive way. The development times are very long. There is significant white space in the development process in traditional design. And by white space, we mean, if you think of the phases of design, between every phase, a new protocol has to be written, a new application has to be made to regulatory authorities and ethics committees. That might be in multiple geographies, multiple member states. And so all of that time that it takes to assess those applications and begin the trials, recruit the patients, all of that white space is a delay in getting product to the market. But in a classically designed trial, you can and always have been able to make changes. They're called protocol amendments. They were never designed to change the fundamental design of the trial, and they still don't. And they're generally considered to be unplanned. So what's the alternative? The alternative is to use an adaptive trial design. And this is specifically the trial design itself. So you use a design that has built into it the possibility of making changes at defined time points within the development of the trial. And this is where I suppose the idea of adaptive licensing and adaptive trials often get very confused. They're not the same thing. A trial design is a specific type of clinical trial, and a pathway or a licensing pathway is the mechanism you use to get your drug on the market. And having an adaptive trial design is only one part of the mechanism of adaptive licensing. So we're going to go into it in more detail. One of the key issues for adaptive trial designs is that they are non-reactive and they're not ad hoc. So you decide at the beginning, what are your potential risks? What are the things you might want to change? So for example, doses. You may want to look at a dose in the beginning with the option of increasing or decreasing that dose depending on what the initial or interim data show. So you propose what your adaptations might be upfront, and you determine what statistical tools you will use to see whether those adaptations will be necessary or not. And that is fixed. So the proposal that you make in the beginning fixes the kind of adaptations you can make and the statistical tools you'll use to determine whether those adaptations can be made or are necessary. So superficially, it sounds pretty easy. Methodologically, and I'm not a statistician, I don't know if we have any statisticians in the audience, but I believe it's particularly difficult. We have a process within clinical trials of independent oversight where there is reason or need to make sure that the sponsor doesn't necessarily have full access to the data, and that's called an independent data monitoring committee or a data safety monitoring board, and their role is significantly greater in an adaptive design. So they're the people that will look at the pooled analytical data at given time points throughout the development process to see whether adaptations should be made. So this graphic shows what an adaptive design would look like. And very often adaptive designs include the use of biomarkers or subpopulations within a treatment population. So in this case, you've got drug A, drug B, and a control group. The control could be placebo or standard of care. And you recruit into the three groups 3 different biomarker subgroups of a given disease. So at the very outset, you're testing for whether individual patients who have this disease have a biomarker that identifies them as a different version, if you like, of that disease. And then at a point in time, at an interim point in time, you review your data and you find out that drug B would appear to be no better than the control for any of the subtypes, where drug A is better for the red subtype but not the other two. So then at the next phase of the development, which is all agreed up front, you discontinue drug B and you recruit in favor of those with the red biomarker, so that you are increasing all the time the likelihood of having a positive outcome of your trial, albeit possibly for a smaller subpopulation of the whole disease. And the idea is to try and avoid getting the wrong answer or avoid taking too long to get the right answer. And a quote that has always resonated with me in relation to the time it takes for drug development is this one. From a patient representative who said the safest drug that no one can afford or that arrives too late is of no benefit to anybody. And I think adaptive design is one of the things that is a part of the adaptive process of licensing that is designed to make sure that drugs are getting on the market faster. So the adaptive pathway then uses the adaptive design as part of its process, but it is actually an approach to licensing and uses a series of legislative or regulatory tools to try and facilitate the adaptive trial design. And that includes things like having early scientific meetings with the regulatory agencies and so on. The regulatory tools available vary by geography, so what you can do in Europe and who you should contact in Europe at what stage and so on differs greatly from what happens in the FDA, but the principles are more or less the same. And ultimately, the requirement is there to prove positive benefit risk. That hasn't changed just because you've changed your approach to the design. So in relation to how the two look, there is a significant paradigm shift from a traditional drug development process to an adaptive drug development process. In a traditional process, you have a single decision, you have randomized clinical trial, a broad population, and you're looking to prove benefit in that full population. In adaptive design, it's lifespan management. So because you narrow down your patient population almost by definition in an adaptive design, the phase 4 data or real world data that we can now mine from health records, and I know the next speaker is talking to us about that, all of that data becomes supportive for possibly expanding the indication of your drug to a broader population in the same disease or even to different diseases in the same general therapeutic area as those data are generated post-licensing. So your initial license covers an enriched patient population, so this central piece where benefit risk is expected, and you've identified, as in the previous graphic, this small subpopulation of a given disease for whom benefit is proven. And then as you develop more data, as you run post-marketing trials and or use things like real-world data and additional data that's available, you then expand your indication as time goes on. And that's almost the reverse of what used to happen with traditional design, where you have the blockbuster drug that treats everything, and then over time you see that it's working better in different populations. But that takes an awful lot longer generate the data to treat the whole population takes an awful lot longer. So the drivers for adaptive pathways are patient demand, really, to treatments. The emerging science that is allowing us, so the biomarker science that's allowing us to determine how the very detailed subgroups in a given disease group. And that has allowed for precision medicines, or medicines that are an awful lot more focused on smaller patient subgroups. And then the influence of payer access. So the payers now have a significant role to play in whether a drug will be reimbursed. So the fact that the clinical trial, the adaptive clinical trial design, shows that it works, that it is efficacious, or that its benefit risk is positive, isn't enough. You then have to show that your value proposition is positive in order for that drug to be reimbursed. So the principles are that it is iterative development. You start small and get larger. It's approval in stages. Ideally, it is used for indications where there is an unmet medical need. You gather evidence as you go, and you have early involvement. In an ideal situation, and certainly the recommendations from the European Medicines Agency, is that you have early involvement of patients and other bodies like the health technology assessment bodies, those that assess whether it's value for money, so that at a very early stage you're taking into consideration the needs of all the stakeholders as opposed to just the needs of the regulatory authority for the licensing of the medicine. It was interesting that in 2013 there was a Tufts round table on adaptive trial design. And it showed that 20% of trials use simple adaptive designs anyway, but that from a dollar point of view, $10 to $20 million potential cost saving annually in early terminations of trials that don't work. So that's actually using an adaptive design to determine it isn't working, but to determine that faster. And overall, global pharma, 5 years of simple adaptive designs would be estimated to save about 70 million a year. And that's not just active cost saving, that's cost saving in time and resource that people are putting into drug development that ultimately is not leading to drugs on the market. So some potential issues then around the adaptive trial process. Stakeholders have to accept a significant level of uncertainty at a very early stage, and some of the stakeholders in the process are not used to that. So patients and payers are not as used to that uncertainty as regulators would be. You need a commitment from the industry, so those developing drugs, that they will continue to generate the evidence that's necessary after the adaptive trial is completed, because that's not the end of the story. This is a lifespan process, and new data need to be added all the time in order to confirm that the adaptive trial design positive result remains positive and to expand into other populations within the subpopulation. There are some indications that with independent review of the data, that those decisions and the commercial decisions of the company might not always be aligned. And so there's a possibility that the company would be unblinded or would have access to data that they wouldn't normally have in a blinded trial. So a lot of care has to be given to maintain the integrity of the data in that regard. IP protection is another issue, because this is a much more long-term development process. In the end of the day, your trial might be shorter, but your development process is longer. And how will IP protection be given to sponsors in that sense? Flexible pricing, so who's going to pay for it, even if it is value for money? And will sponsors start to take some level of risk themselves? So I think there was at least one proposal this year where a sponsor agreed to shoulder some of the risk that the drugs wouldn't work in a given patient population. It hasn't really seen great use at the moment, but they're called managed entry agreements, and I have a feeling they'll probably become something that we see more of. And obviously investigational product supply. So if you're changing the trial as you go along, you have to make sure that you have access to the right product at the right dose and the right formulation at the right point in time. And that's a significant organizational challenge for a sponsor who's manufacturing clinical trial product. So just then to summarize, really, it's not for all trials, it's not going to work for everything, but if it's done well, it can certainly improve efficiency, reduce cost, maximize information gathered, and minimize risk to patients. But the one thing that won't do is save poor trial design or make ineffective treatments appear effective. So it's not the holy grail, but it's certainly a change in the approach that should hopefully facilitate medicines to get on the market faster. Thank you.